She had driven 4 hours to get there. She sat in the driveway for 40 minutes. And then she put the car back in reverse and drove away. That was not a cowardly moment. That was the bravest thing she had done in 38 years. What you are about to hear is not a story about a dramatic family implosion. There were no visible bruises, no screaming matches that the neighbors heard, no event that would hold up as an obvious explanation at a dinner party. And that is exactly what made it so difficult to leave, and exactly why her story matters. Because the families that are hardest to walk away from are not the obviously broken ones. They are the ones that look from the outside like they are held together by love. The ones where the control is dressed in the language of devotion. The ones where asking for space is treated as evidence of betrayal. Her name was Nadia, 38 years old. She lived in Chicago, in a clean apartment on the north side with good light and a small balcony she rarely used. She was a physical therapist, the kind of professional who had genuine care for her patients, the kind of person her colleagues called dependable and her friends called the steady one. She had a life that functioned well. She went to the gym. She cooked real food. She read. She had 3 close friends who knew her well and loved her. By the measures that tend to count, Nadia was doing fine. What she could not fully explain to anyone, including herself for a long time, was why doing fine still felt like barely breathing. She had grown up in a close-knit Lebanese-American family in a suburb of Detroit. 3 generations in the same city, Sunday dinners every week without exception, a family that presented itself to the world with warmth and a particular kind of pride. They were generous people in the ways that could be seen. In the ways that could not be seen, in the private negotiations of love and expectation and belonging, the rules were different. And Nadia had been following those invisible rules since before she was old enough to understand they were rules at all. In Nadia's family, love and obligation had been fused so completely that she had spent most of her adult life unable to tell them apart. Her mother, Mira, was not a villain in any simple sense. She was a woman who had sacrificed genuinely, who had worked and worried and given in the particular total way that some parents do, and who had, over decades, come to experience her children's independence as a form of ingratitude. Every choice Nadia made that pulled her further from the center of the family's orbit was received not as a natural development but as evidence that she did not love them enough. The mechanism was not cruelty. It was grief, performed so consistently and sincerely that it functioned like a system. When Nadia moved to Chicago at 27 for a job opportunity, her mother did not forbid it. She simply became visibly unwell for several months, not in a fabricated way, but in the real way of a person whose emotional architecture cannot accommodate separation. Every phone call during those months began with an update on how difficult things were at home without her. Every visit ended with a tearful departure that made Chicago feel less like a choice Nadia had made and more like something she was doing to her family. Her father was different, quieter, more measured, but he operated in the same system by a different method. He did not apply pressure directly. He expressed disappointment in the long, considered way of a man who wanted you to understand that he was not disappointed in you, exactly, only in the situation you had created. He was the family's moral authority, and his approval was the thing Nadia had been quietly, constantly working to earn since childhood. Even in her late 30s, a raised eyebrow from her father could undo an afternoon. She knew this. She was ashamed of knowing it, which made it worse. Her brother and sister had navigated the family differently. Her brother had married young, into a family her mother approved of, and had settled 2 streets away from the family home, a proximity that was treated as evidence of his good character. Her sister had become the family's designated crisis manager, the one who absorbed tension and redistributed it as humor, who called their mother every day and had learned to shrink her own needs to the size of something the family could accommodate. Nadia had tried to do neither of those things, and had spent a decade being quietly punished for it in ways that were always just deniable enough to be impossible to directly address. Nadia was not someone who complained. That had been trained out of her early. In her family, need was acceptable only when it was someone else's. Her own needs had been, since childhood, a matter of management. You had them, you did not burden others with them, and if you were asked how you were doing, you said fine and meant it to the extent that you could. She had brought this habit into every relationship she had ever had. She was the friend who helped, not the friend who asked for help. She was the colleague who stayed late, not the one who left when the work was done. She had built a life that functioned beautifully for everyone around her and quietly starved her. She started seeing a therapist at 34. Not because she had decided she needed help, but because a colleague mentioned it in passing and the word therapist lit something small and urgent in her chest that she did not have language for yet. In the first 2 years of therapy, she spent most of the sessions defending her family, explaining why her mother behaved the way she did, providing context that softened the edges of things. Her therapist listened to all of it with patience and asked, eventually, a very specific question. Who explained and contextualized and softened the edges of things for Nadia? That question took her 6 months to answer. The answer, when it arrived, was uncomfortable: nobody. Nadia had spent 38 years being the person who held things together for others and had quietly assumed that was simply what love looked like. Her therapist introduced her to a word she had heard before but never applied to herself: enmeshment. The state of being so fused with a family system that your own identity, your preferences, your limits, your needs, your very sense of what you want, exists only in reference to what the family requires of you. She sat with that word for a long time. It fit too well to be comfortable. The breaking point arrived during a family gathering for her father's 65th birthday. Nadia had driven the 4 hours from Chicago. She had brought a gift that took her 3 weeks to choose. She had arranged her schedule around the weekend and arrived early to help her mother prepare. And in the kitchen, in the middle of the preparations, her mother said something that she had, in various forms, been saying for years. She said, calmly, without intending harm, which was the point, that she did not understand why Nadia could not simply move back. That a woman her age, without a husband, without children, would be happier at home. That the life she was living in Chicago was not really a life. That all that space she needed was just loneliness she had not admitted to yet. Nadia did not respond. She had learned, over many years, that responding created arguments and arguments created scenes and scenes became the family's story of her difficulty. She finished helping her mother. She ate dinner. She smiled at appropriate moments. She drove back to Chicago that night instead of staying as she had planned and reached her apartment at 2 in the morning. She sat in the parking garage for a long time before going upstairs. And what she felt, sitting in that garage at 2 in the morning, was not anger. It was something older and heavier. It was grief for the person she might have been if she had been allowed, from the beginning, to simply be one. That night, she did something she had not done in a long time. She called her closest friend, a woman named Dara, at 2:15 in the morning. Dara answered. Nadia said, "I need to tell you something I have never said to anyone out loud." And then she said it. The version of her family that she had never spoken, the one she had been protecting and explaining and softening for 38 years. Dara listened to all of it. When Nadia was finished, Dara said, "I know. I have been waiting for you to say it." Nadia did not leave dramatically. She had never been dramatic, and she saw no reason to start. She spent 3 weeks deciding exactly what she wanted to say and how to say it, not to wound and not to argue, but to be finally and completely honest in a way she had never been permitted to be in that family. She told her mother, in a phone call she had rehearsed until it was steady, that she loved her, and that she needed a period of significant distance in order to understand who she was outside of the role she had been assigned. She said it clearly. She did not apologize for saying it. That was the hardest part, finishing the sentence without the apology that had always followed every real thing she had ever said. Her mother's response was what Nadia had expected and what she had prepared for. Tears. Then silence. Then the suggestion that Nadia was unwell, that the therapist had put ideas in her head, that this was not who Nadia really was. Her father called an hour later, measured, disappointed, asking her to reconsider. Her brother sent a message saying he did not understand what was happening. Her sister called and said nothing much, but stayed on the phone for a long time, and breathed, and Nadia understood that to be its own kind of answer. She did not cut contact entirely, not at first, and perhaps not ever completely. What she did was set a shape to the relationship for the first time in her life. Monthly contact instead of weekly. Phone calls with a clear end time. No visits for 6 months while she found her footing. No discussions of her relationship status, her apartment, her choices, or what the family thought she should do differently. These were not punishments. They were the first honest description she had ever given of what she needed in order to remain in the relationship at all. And the family's response to those needs confirmed everything her therapist had been quietly pointing toward for 4 years. The weeks that followed were the strangest of her life. She had expected relief, and it came, but not cleanly. What arrived alongside it was a grief she had not anticipated, not for the family she had left, but for the version of the relationship she had always hoped was possible. The one where she was loved as she was, rather than as she was needed to be. She mourned that version of her family in the way you mourn something that never existed, which is a particular and exhausting kind of grief, because there is no specific loss to point to. Just the slow, accurate recognition that what you had hoped for was never on offer. She also had to navigate the social fallout, something she had known was coming and had still underestimated. Extended family members reached out with messages that were framed as concern and functioned as pressure. A cousin she had always been close to went quiet in a way that communicated clearly which side of things she had chosen. Community members who had known Nadia since childhood, people at her parents' mosque, neighbors who had watched her grow up, now possessed a version of her story that had been written by the people she had set limits with. She could not correct it. She had to let it stand. That required a kind of dignity she had to practice. The doubt was real and it arrived on schedule. In the middle of the night, in the middle of ordinary Tuesdays, in the particular ache of holiday seasons spent differently than every holiday season she had ever known. She wondered whether she had made too much of things. Whether she had been, as her mother had said, influenced into something she would regret. She brought all of it to therapy, week after week, and her therapist did something valuable. She did not tell Nadia what to feel. She asked Nadia to compare how she felt during the 6 months of distance to how she had felt during the 6 months before. The comparison was not subtle. Something shifted around the 4-month mark. Not dramatically, but in the way that real things shift, which is slowly and without announcement. Nadia began noticing that she was making decisions differently. Small ones first. Where to go on a weekend, what to do on a Sunday morning, whether to accept a social invitation. These decisions had always come with a background layer of calculation, how it would be received, what it would mean to the family, whether it confirmed the version of her that her mother had always worried about. Without that background layer, the decisions were just decisions. The quiet was so unfamiliar it took her several weeks to recognize it as her own. Her friendships deepened in ways she had not expected. With the family management no longer consuming the center of her emotional life, she had room, actual, available room, to be present with the people who had been asking for her real self for years. She told Dara things she had never told anyone. She let another friend help her when she was going through a hard week, instead of insisting she was fine. She cried in front of people she trusted and did not apologize for it. These things sound small. They were enormous. For a woman who had been taught that her needs were a burden, allowing them to be real and witnessed was a kind of revolution. At month 6, she reached out to her mother. Not to re-enter the old pattern, but to begin, if possible, something different. The conversation was careful and imperfect. Her mother was not transformed. But there were moments, small ones easy to miss, where something moved. Where her mother asked a question instead of making a statement. Where she listened for a few seconds longer than she usually did. Nadia did not call it progress. She called it information. and she kept her limits in place while she gathered it. There are things Nadia's story teaches that comfortable advice rarely reaches. The first is about the particular danger of the invisible kind of family difficulty, the kind that produces no obvious evidence, only a persistent erosion. These families are the hardest to leave because they leave you without a clear story to tell. There is no villain. There is no single event that explains everything. There is only the accumulated weight of a system that required you to be less than yourself in order to function. Recognizing that is hard. Saying it out loud is harder. Acting on it may be the hardest thing you ever do. The second lesson is about the confusion between love and enmeshment. Enmeshment feels like love from the inside, and it is, in part. The feelings are real. The care is real. But love in its healthiest form allows the person being loved to become more fully themselves. It does not require them to remain a certain size or play a certain role in order for the relationship to survive. When a relationship, any relationship including a family one, cannot tolerate your growth, your needs, or your honesty, what it is offering you is not love in full. It is love with conditions that you are not allowed to see clearly. The third lesson is about the guilt that follows a decision like this, and it will follow, reliably, for a long time. The guilt is not evidence that you made the wrong choice. In families where love and obligation have been fused, guilt is simply the feeling of an enmeshed system detecting that you have moved outside its boundaries. It is a signal designed to return you to where you were. It is not a moral judgment from the universe. It is a trained response in a body that learned, very early, that its value was conditional on compliance. You can feel it and still choose differently. Feeling guilt does not mean you have done wrong. The fourth lesson, and perhaps the most urgent one for those who need to hear it, is this. Walking away from a toxic family dynamic is not the same as walking away from your family. It is walking away from a specific set of patterns that require your damage in order to continue. The people involved may be capable of a different relationship with you. Some of them, given time and distance, will be. Others will not. You will not know which is which until you create enough space to find out. But the only version of the relationship worth returning to is one that does not require you to disappear inside it in order to belong. A year after the driveway moment, after the night she put the car in reverse and drove away from the house she had been driving toward for 38 years, Nadia went to Lake Michigan on an early Saturday morning in October. She did this alone, which had once felt like a statement she needed permission to make. Now it was simply what she was doing on a Saturday morning in October. She brought coffee. She stood at the water for a long time. She did not think about her family, particularly. She thought about what she wanted for lunch. She thought about a book she was in the middle of. She thought about nothing much at all. She was simply a woman at a lake on a Saturday morning, occupying her own life without apology or explanation. That, she thought, is what they had been trying to take from her. Not her love. Just this ordinary, unglamorous, entirely hers Saturday morning. The hardest goodbye is not the one you say out loud. It is the one you say quietly to yourself, to the version of you that kept hoping the relationship would become what it had always promised to be, if you just tried harder, stayed longer, needed less. That goodbye is the real one. And you have to let yourself grieve it properly before you can understand what you are actually walking toward. Leaving a family that used love as a leash is not something you do once and then it is done. It is something you choose, again and again, every time the old gravity tries to pull you back. And slowly, not all at once and not without grief, the choosing becomes less like resistance and more like simply knowing who you are. Nadia knows now. She is still learning. She is still on the right Saturday mornings at the lake. That is enough. That is, in fact, everything. If this story spoke to you, if you recognize something in Nadia that you have never been able to put into words for yourself, subscribe for more stories that help you see life differently. Because sometimes the most important thing is not a solution. It is simply knowing that the thing you